Hi everyone, it's my pleasure to present to you a summary of the Global Earthquake Model, or GEM Foundation, and the lessons that we've learned about partnerships at local, national, regional, and global levels. The problem we see is that the rise of cities in earthquake-prone areas, urban populations are increasing rapidly. There has historically been a lack of data, of tools, of capability in doing hazard and risk assessment. And there's been a lack of consensus and consistency in the way to do the analysis. So in 2009, when the Global Earthquake Model was conceived, the idea was to create a global collaboration network, one that would be cooperative, that would work across public and private sectors, and that would be able to reach and engage with stakeholders in all fields across the world. So in 2009, we were created as a nonprofit and then later a non-governmental organization by the UN. We organized to develop software, tools, and data for use in earthquake hazard and risk assessment worldwide with hazard, risk, and IT technical capability. The idea was to use these tools, this information, and the collaboration network underlying it to develop trust in the assessment process, to develop ownership of those results across users, and in turn to promote and foster their applications to disaster risk reduction. So our vision then, through this process, is to eventually have a world that is resilient to earthquakes and other natural hazards. So when we started, we had Working Program 1 in 2009, and we basically, over 5-year increments, we developed into what GEM is today. So we started with developing global partnerships with engaging research institutions around the world, and initiated the development of the OpenQuake engine. In the second phase, we released an OpenQuake platform, which then made OpenQuake much more broadly available across the world. We, at the end of that period, in 2018, we issued the first global earthquake hazard map and accompanying earthquake risk map. And we then began to start, during that period as well, we became much more applications oriented. We started developing and being much more engaged with projects locally to regionally. So in the third phase, we've been able to develop a much more diverse set of models and tools that have appealed to across public and private sectors. And we have also extended some of our capability into multi-hazard analysis, particularly volcanic risk, as well as landslide and liquefaction. And we've been able to work also at the urban level or metropolitan level to really work at risk assessment at the level that is really needed to make a difference in communities. Our flagship products are the Global Hazard Map, the Global Risk Map, and the engine itself, as I mentioned just briefly. But these products and the tools underlying it are widely used and are constantly being evolved. Underlying this process is a framework for collaboration, and it's guided by global drivers for sustainable development and for instance also the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and our principles for collaboration, for openness, public good, and scientific credibility. These principles are very important to building our relationships and the trust to use the products. So we have a secretariat that does a lot of the underlying work. We report to a governing board of our sponsors. We have project partners as well through various mechanisms. Together, this represents essentially the GEM network. This information gets fed out to product users and stakeholders and ultimately to disaster risk reduction activities. And it's important to note that there's a very strong feedback loop. So we are engaging through to the ultimate users and stakeholders and using that to improve our methods and models and bring in information that can be used more effectively. Our supporters, there's a governing board made of voting members, public governors and private governors, and you can see many institutions there that are supporting and driving the work we do. We have advisor sponsors that contribute at a slightly lower level, and we have associates, which are commonly institutions such as the UN or the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, which operate globally and provide advice and assistance in coordinating work across various sectors. The collaboration framework then is an ecosystem, and it allows us to build upon collaborations and partnerships to work at multiple levels across sectors and across scales, from global to local. And now I'd like to give a few examples working at these different levels. At the local level, a recent example that we've completed in work with USAID as our funding partner is the TREC, or Training and Education for Earthquake Risk Assessment. This involved communities in Latin America, Quito, Ecuador, Santiago de los Caballeros in Dominican Republic, and Cali, Colombia. The idea was to help develop capacity for urban earthquake hazard and risk assessment at the local level, to engage and collaborate across these organizations and communities, and ultimately to strengthen risk assessment opportunities that could be extended to other areas around the world. And importantly, the collaboration wasn't just at community level, it was with many other organizations at national level as well in each of these organizations, including national geological surveys. The outputs of this work are now being used to inform emergency and disaster response planning in each of the three cities that we studied. Now, at national level, there are a few examples that I think are important. Firstly, with Canada. Canada has worked very closely with us for more than 5 years now, and we've worked with them closely to develop a new generation earthquake hazard model and map. They're actually on the second generation of that, and a national earthquake risk model. So one of the few that's been developed by a national government. This collaboration has been closely with the Geological Survey of Canada, part of Natural Resources Canada, and there's actually been a wide group of other organizations in Canada that have been brought together under a collaboration framework within Canada to make this work across different levels of government and different sectors. Again, at the national level, in Turkey, we've worked very closely with World Bank in a recently completed project to help the Turkish government identify priorities for retrofitting health facilities across the country, and this was through a detailed risk analysis and cost-benefit analysis, which then helped drive the implementation of mitigation efforts across the country. In the Philippines, we work closely with the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, or PHIVOLCS, and in this case, their local capacity capability for assessing risk was actually quite developed, but it was not in a fully probabilistic framework, and so we helped them in particular to develop a probabilistic earthquake hazard model implemented in OpenQuake, and the results are now being used to determine the demands of the National Structural Code of the Philippines. Now moving to regional level, in Europe, we work closely with the European Union in developing a seismic hazard and risk model, and the maps that you see here, hazard at the top and risk at the bottom. And this work is released last year and is now providing the basis for improving building regulation at the regional level through Eurocode 8. Now, at the global level, all of the information I've described previously is essentially aggregated through what we call a mosaic. So what you see here is the global probabilistic hazard map, 10% probability of exceedance in 50 years for peak ground acceleration, which is kind of the standard for reference to building safety worldwide. And at the bottom you see the various essentially areas of the maps at national to regional level that have been brought together under a common framework, in most cases using OpenQuake, and certainly a common methodology. So it can be considered in many respects a homogeneous process. And for risk, this is looking at buildings and the economic loss to buildings worldwide for average annual loss. At the bottom, we have the two examples of exposure: the total replacement cost for buildings and the total number of buildings worldwide, which fundamentally underpins our ability to assess risk globally. So importantly, from the point of view of geological organizations, there's quite a lot of work that is particularly involved in building the earthquake maps and models. I note here at the top the Global Active Fault Database, which is something that GEM has developed and maintains, and we rely on geological organizations and universities and so forth to inform this map and the database. And so this is a very much not only an active fault database, but it's an active database that relies on continual updating and improvement. That's informing the development of what we're calling the global block model. So this brings the global block model brings together geodetic data and other information driven by plate tectonics into the next generation of earthquake hazard models, which is currently being developed by GEM in collaboration with many organizations. Into the future, we're looking to maintain our earthquake expertise and global leadership in terms of the sorts of activities I've just described. We are working increasingly in a multi-hazard environment. Many of our tools, particularly also the exposure data, is very relevant and applicable across other hazard domains. And it's also driving an interest in future risk. So we're looking into how to extrapolate our understanding of exposure and risk into the future, also to assist with climate risk estimates into the future. And this is critically important for input into disaster risk reduction activities, which have very long time horizons in terms of evolving the building environment and reducing the risk. Here we have a conceptual view of how the world of natural hazard risk assessment has evolved and is heading into the future. On the left column are the data and models with increasing complexity from bottom to top, starting with fundamental geologic data, seismicity catalogs, and moving to impact scenarios and probabilistic models and so forth to what we might call integrated risk assessments and disaster risk reduction solutions. Across the top, we have essentially the evolution of data providers and the corresponding users according to each successive level of data and modeling capability. At the first level then, the orange level, we're dealing mainly with alerts and warnings that are used by the media or emergency management. And essentially, I would say this is the capability we had more or less worldwide, say in 1980. But with time, we've been gradually improving the information tools and models on the left column, so we can now reach ever more sophisticated users and applications on the top and to the right. So at the moment, I put GEM and much of the disaster risk reduction community more or less in the middle of this diagram. So we're pretty good at building codes, and certainly the insurance industry is using probabilistic models now of risk for risk transfer applications. And we're now beginning to reach into integrated risk management and ultimately what we describe as sustainable development. So this is that process, and I think it's a useful way to look at the evolution in capability, the evolution in the science and the tools that is helping to drive better decision making for disaster risk reduction. So finally, I would just like to say that GEM is really here to support you. And to underscore there are various ways that we can collaborate. We have sponsors, of course, but we also work very closely with organizations, with governments, etc., to provide tools, to provide training on hazard and risk assessment, to collaborate in the development of hazard and risk models and maps, and to help you connect with other organizations globally with similar interests. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and wish you all a good conference. Thank you very much.